Welcome to the Around the Table podcast. This podcast is all about the ministry and preaching of Lebanon Baptist Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. Hosted by the pastors of Lebanon Baptist Church. The goal is to help you grow in your faith and spiritual walk with the Lord every single day of your life. To learn more about Lebanon Baptist Church, visit lbcnow.org. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started.
Church, thank you for joining us again for episode 7 of our Around the Table podcast. This has been a fun series to be a part of, a fun series to listen to. So we're excited that you're joining us for this conversation as we talk about relevant issues in our day and age. My name is David. This is Pastor Matt. And in this series, we have been unpacking a little bit deeper what we've been going through and talking about on Sunday mornings. And so this past week, we were in Daniel chapter 5. And before we even get anything rolling today, I got to just make a note. Real talk. This is a legit conversation that I had with someone. In the 11 o'clock service, they came up to me and said, "What's wrong with Pastor Matt? He got done so early today."
I finished at 11:59 in the second service. Yeah. Probably if you go back and look at it, it was at least a 35-minute sermon. But, yeah.
Even the 9:30, we were done at what, 10:40?
Yeah, we were, weren't we?
10:35.
Yeah.
There was an ample amount of time.
Yeah, I cut it just a little short, didn't I? Yeah, I don't know why I did that.
Is that a regular occurrence?
I don't think so.
Happen?
No, I don't think so.
I tried. You can see that I clearly tried.
Yeah, no, I doubt it. But, yeah, I feel embarrassed when I don't.
No way.
Anyway, no, it was good. Yeah. People sometimes wonder that, but it was, I don't know, just kind of got finished. Yeah.
It happens. Hopefully it happens more often, maybe.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see. No, so we jumped into Daniel chapter 5, which is the story where people know it as the writing on the wall, where we see that mysterious hand come and write out that phrase. And ultimately what happens after that is King Belshazzar is killed. His
confusing, isn't it? It's confusing, isn't it? Because you got the king in there is Belshazzar.
Yeah.
Daniel's name the Babylonian name they gave Daniel was Belteshazzar. Mm-hmm. So Belshazzar, King Belteshazzar for Daniel. Yeah, it's confusing.
Yeah. So,
but
sorry
anyway,
about that.
that hand shows up, mm-hmm. right? So yeah.
And ultimately, the big issue from this story was a pride thing. Is what he was struggling from, and he was not living how we ought to live in light of eternity. And I think that's something that all of us struggle with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that was kind of the direction that I was sort of trying to take it practically, looking at that and thinking about pride, was just not living in light of eternity. Mm-hmm. And that was where I think King Belshazzar was. He was just lifted up in pride and felt like, the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian army mm-hmm. is surrounding our city, but they're not coming through these walls. We've got impenetrable walls. We've got strong defenses. We've got enough food and water for 20 years. They had secured all that. And so they thought, we're fine. But in an act of pride, he brings those vessels in from the temple from Jerusalem that they had taken decades earlier. Yeah. He brings them out of his temple, the temple there in Babylon, brings them from their temple and uses them and kind of desecrates them in to study the detail of the party that he was throwing that night and the kinds of things that they would have been doing, the desecration and the evil things that they would have been doing with all of that in a way to make a mockery of God and God's prophecy that Babylon would fall to the Medes and the Persians, to the Medo-Persian army. God had already prophesied that. So this is kind of like, well, we think we're pretty secure in ourselves. And it was a mockery of God. And so, but how do we get to that in our day and age? Most of us aren't proud in that kind of way. To that extreme. Yeah. And so, you just think if Belshazzar believed, if that king believed that Jehovah, that God was in control and was the one that he would answer to, mm-hmm. and if he believed that, he would he would have lived very differently
for sure.
in light of all that. And I think, so that's where, all right, now from a level of application, how do we as Christians today, because most of our audience are Christians on Sunday morning, they're Christ followers, and we're the church, and the sermon is primarily intended for the church. And so how do we live like that? And that was kind of the question I tried to wrestle with. How do we live similarly, not really giving thought to eternity in the moment? And that kind of was what spurred me towards some of the application that I got to.
Yeah, so where you went was, what are some things that interfere with the way we interact with our culture, friends, family, but ultimately the way that we interact with God and some of those distractions? Do you think this thing, the level of distraction that we struggle and we battle with today, you think this is a new thing, or do you think this is something that has been around for multiple generations, and it just looks different today?
Yeah. So basically, the way we got to that in the sermon, from a distraction standpoint, was okay. What we might call practical atheists. Craig Rochelle wrote a book a few years ago. I think it was titled "The Christian Atheist." That would be a person who says they believe in God, but they live day in and day out for all practical purposes as if he doesn't exist. And so my thought is, do we do that, right? Do we live saying we believe that God exists, we believe God is sovereign, we believe he's in control, and we believe we're going to have to answer to him for how we spend our time and what we do. We're going to have to answer for how we live now in light of eternity or not. He'll judge us, and we know that. Yeah. So we say we believe that. We believe those things to be true, but then Monday through Saturday, and just throughout life, we live practically as if he doesn't exist. Okay. Well, what contributes to that? I think the major contributor to living that way for us as Christians is that we're distracted from thinking about thoughts of eternity, right? And so that was kind of where we got off. And, are we more distracted today than previous generations? And this is just practical in life in general. Are we more distracted today? Are the levels of distraction today different from those in previous generations?
I wonder, right now we're kind of in a societal shift, maybe with the implementation of different devices, smartphones, iPads, different technology that is readily at our use. But a generation ago when the TV was coming out, a generation ago when the radio was coming out, was it just a different form of distraction back then, or is this a new level today?
Yeah, so I would say that the smartphone and the iPhone is categorically different from radio and TV. So, and I mean, thinking about my own time growing up, the television, you could not watch stuff on demand. You had to watch whatever it was. When I was a kid growing up, you had to watch whatever it was that was on when it was on. Yeah. Before that, I mean, we had cable, but we didn't have DVR in our house at that time. And my parents growing up, they only had just a small few channels and they all, think about my parents as kids, and I know what it was like because I spent a lot of the summer with my grandparents, and they didn't have cable. And so it was like I got to experience the growing up during the summer like my parents experienced growing up. So, we would watch the same show together on TV. Like my only experience during the summer living with my grandparents with TV was watching like Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune and the news. I mean, that's what we did that together. Like there was no, and they didn't have phones. And like as kids, we would sit together after dinner. We'd watch the same show. Yeah. Okay, that's different. Now kids are going to bed with their phone, and at all hours, day and night, they are being tempted to engage with any number of things on there that just. So my engagement with media as a kid, very different. Mm-hmm. And so, for anybody that would say, oh, you're just getting old and you're just getting old and that kind of thing, like, thinking that the days were better. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that it was better back then, but I am just saying the temptation is very different. And the temptation from this device is categorically different from, even you think about like pornography and some of that, the temptation for that for people with a phone is very different from the temptation for what that would have been like in previous generations, And so I think we're dealing with something categorically different. There has always been the temptation to think about things that take our mind off of more important things. That has always been there. But I don't think we've ever lived in a society and in a day and age, we've never lived in a time like this one where it's relentless. Everywhere you turn. I mean, we're definitely, I would say no doubt about it, we are definitely more distracted today than any other generation in history. The iPhone didn't come out till 2007. Okay, so I had just graduated college. Like my middle school, high school, and college experience with a phone was not a smartphone. I mean, when I was in high school, I got my first phone at 16 years of age. It was a little flip phone. I think I had like 30 text messages you could send in the month before you would have to pay extra. And I don't know, 200 minutes you could talk on it or something. I mean, It was literally like my parents gave it to me. Hey, if you're broke down on the side of the road and you need help, this is what you use it for. You use the phone for that. Like that's about all you did with it. And so it progressed a little bit through high school and college and stuff, but you couldn't do what you can do with the phone now. So that was very different. You think about the iPhone not coming out. It's only been out since 2007. I mean, I didn't have a smartphone in the truest sense until after I was married. An iPhone. I didn't have an iPhone when it first came out. I waited a couple of years before I went over to that. And so, I mean, that's just a very different world. I mean, think about people working in an office job today with their phone. Like, I'm supposed to be working on this proposal and this spreadsheet and getting these details put together, but I'm constantly doing something else and checking my phone. And I mean,
I would say we're probably somewhat of this culture, more of a multitasking culture. I think it's something like even just the implementation of AirPods, where we can be present in the moment physically, but with something, a small little device in your ear, mentally, we are totally somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, everybody multitasks all the time.
Yeah.
Now, technically speaking, neurologists, neuroscientists and all, they say you can't do two things at once. Your brain is just rapid fire switching from one back to the other. And so, I think you cannot work on, I would say, you cannot work on with effectiveness. You cannot do deep, meaningful work while you're constantly being interrupted and distracted. It takes quite a while for your brain to fully engage on a task, and every time it's interrupted, you have to start back over. And so, depending upon what you're doing, I think matters. But we definitely, we do a lot of things, multitasking back and forth. I mean, people driving down the road, they're on their phone. They're not supposed to be texting and driving or on our phone and driving, but distracted driving. I mean, think about driving like something that is very scary and dangerous. I mean, it can be a dangerous thing to be involved in an accident, and people are distracted while they're driving. I mean, we're at that point, in our culture. I mean, look, I found this to be funny. It wasn't funny at the time, but looking back on it, a couple years ago when I messed my knee up playing basketball and I tore my MCL and my patellofemoral, dislocated my kneecap. It was like the next day, but my knee was like the size of a volleyball. And I'm like, I finally think I need to go to the doctor. So I go down to the emergency ortho care place. I walk in. There's nobody in the waiting room. There's one lady sitting behind the desk. I mean, I can barely walk. I'm like limping. Drive myself down there, walk over there, limp over there. She's on her phone sitting at the desk, and she's scrolling on Facebook or Instagram or something because she's scrolling. She doesn't even look up. She just points and says, "You'll need to check in over there." And she points at a stand-up kiosk.
Seriously?
Yeah. And I'm like, I can barely stand, and I have to limp over there and stand. And I just think like, that's where we're at today. I mean, I've gone into fast food restaurants and there have been 4 or 5 people standing around, and they'll say, you can place your order over there at that kiosk. And, it's such a different world that we live in. But I thought it's just different. I'm like, here's somebody down being paid to be here, and you're. So, look, I read this statistic, and then we'll jump into some other questions, but. The average person today, once out of bed, they check their phone over 221 times a day. That's once every 4 minutes. And probably they're checking it more than once every 4 minutes because people, they tend to, research indicates that people tend to underestimate when they're asked questions about screen time and phone usage and anything like that. They'll underestimate it. Yeah. So, every 4 minutes, you just think about that. So there's definitely distractions, and those distractions from a spiritual standpoint is where we want to get to. I think that's a challenge to try to manage our level of distractedness. But I definitely think we're distracted more today than we ever have been before. And we have to learn how to deal with that.
So elaborate on that a little bit. How do you think those distractions interfere with relationships, be friends, family, but then ultimately maybe even spiritually?
I'm sorry, what? You're right. Sorry, I had to check something on my phone there. But yeah, it interferes with relationships. I think the new phrase, or there's a new phrase called it's PHUBBING, phubbing. Phubbing is this thing where where your phone is interfering with your relationships. And your relationship. We've all seen people sitting around a table, out to dinner with friends, and they're all on their phones. Yeah. And I don't think that level of relationship and interaction is as healthy as talking and face to face. And then when you're interacting with people who are not even present with you, there's a lot of research. Levels of empathy have declined because of communicating through technology rather than face to face. I feel, when I say something to you in person here, if it's the least bit hurtful or difficult, I feel something as I see it impact you, and you don't get that through screens. And so there are measurable declines in empathy. I think that hurts our relationships in general in the world. We don't care, and we're not as compassionate as we used to be in society because of that. So I think that's a major thing. This book I mentioned Sunday, I want to highly recommend it. It's called 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You by Tony Reinke, and we can link to this in the description. But he points out top of page 42 in his first chapter where it's just we are addicted to distraction. And he goes in there and just talks about from the spiritual standpoint, okay? He says, I'm no stranger to the instinctive phone grab, the feeling to reach out and grab the phone. But he wanted to see if other Christians kind of shared that same pattern. And so he surveyed 8,000 Christians about social media routines. More than half, 54% admitted to checking their phone within just minutes of waking up. Now, for most of us, I would venture to guess we check it before we even completely roll out of bed. Sure. It's right there.
It's probably the first thing you grab, the last thing you put up at night.
Right, yeah. And so we check that. And so he goes on to say that he asked those 8,000, 73% of them, they engaged with their phone and with social media even, but 73% engaged with that before any time in the Word or devotions or any time with God. And so if that's the first thing, if the first thing that's on our mind is whatever this is pushing to us, I think that impacts our spiritual relationship. And so, I think he puts it like that. I think that's a good way to look at it. Tim Keller one time was asked, why do you think young Christian adults struggle most deeply with God as a personal reality in their lives? And he said, noise and distraction. It is easier to tweet than pray. And it's just much easier. It is much easier to unintentionally, mindlessly let something else tell us what we should be thinking about than thinking about what we ought to be thinking about and to disciplining ourselves in that way. So I do think it impacts us in a negative way. And from Reinke, I said Sunday, one of his quotes that as in every age, and this is what transcends technology, but in every age, God calls his children to stop, study what captures their attention in this world. So we need to stop and we need to study what is capturing my attention in this world, and then weigh the consequences of that and fight for undistracted hearts before him. And I just think it's more challenging today than it ever has been before. And so I think we got to think deeply about that. If we can't read Scripture and pray and have conversation with God and communion with God for more than 4 minutes without having to check, the phone. And sometimes, a lot of times we're not even, it's not buzzing, we just reach for it. And then other times it's just buzzing and, it's just we're constantly being interrupted in our relationship. And that if we think about our relationship with God like a relationship, I mean, how much would Janelle feel that you really love and prioritize your relationship with her if y'all are trying to have a serious conversation and in a span of 10 minutes, you look at your phone 3 or 4 times?
Wouldn't go well.
It wouldn't go well. And it would say to her that, you're not prioritizing that, and she would think you're not hearing what she's saying and those kinds of things. And so I think, that it impacts our relationship with God too, in that way.
That's a really good word. At the time of this recording, this is early June, so school's just ended. Most of the high school graduations were last week, so summertime, kids are at home. Naturally, the easy thing to do is jump on video games for screen time to go way up. That's the easy fallback, I would say. So what are some practical things, guidelines that parents can implement when specifically talking about digital distractions? Yeah,
just healthy. And again, this is a question I think all parents who love their kids have to wrestle with, the question of how much media and technology to allow for them and how to set parameters for that. You have to, as a parent, give thought to that today. And so I think some healthy habits, would include like having limits. I mean, living without limits around technology and letting kids live limitlessly in terms of their technology use, whether that's TV, video games, phone, iPad. I think you got to have limits. Now, for everybody, it's going to be a little different and for their context and situation, but setting limits, that's important. How much are we going to allow screen time? So I think that's one that's very important. I also think if if your kids have tablets or a phone, I would highly encourage parents not to let them take those things to bed with them.
Yeah.
I mean, the research is strong in terms of the effects on our brain and not allowing us to sleep when we're looking at screens right before we go to bed and some of that. And I think protecting kids from that is important. The the level of anxiety that kids experience today as a result of engagement with social media is so strong that I absolutely, if I had a teenager, I absolutely would not allow them onto social media until they're older, at least an older teenager for sure. I mean, that's my recommendation. I mean, I just read of a couple the other day, very prominent couple in American culture, and they were just came out in an interview and they were talking about how they don't allow their teenagers to have any social media access until they're out of the house. And so because of knowing some of this and the effects, so I would set parameters on that. I think a good thing would be for adults to set examples in that too. So, we're going to require our kids, for example, like say you're going to require the kids to leave the phone in the kitchen and overnight. So by a certain time, the phone has to go here to be plugged up to charge. Well, you do that too. You set that example too. There ought to be technology phone-free places in the home because it's just so much easier to let everybody do their own thing. But it's not, think about watching movies today too. Like even when I'm growing up, we would watch a movie together. That was a big deal. Like the family would sit down and watch a movie together. And, now everybody's watching their own things in different rooms. Yeah. And I just, I think I would set parameters and I would absolutely, if you have a teenager with an iPad or a phone or something like that, a smartphone, I would have, like Covenant Eyes, and I would have some of that safeguarding technology on it that would help monitor what they are actually looking at and interacting with. So I would definitely do that. And I mean, I'll mention this too. I read this. I read some articles this morning just doing a Google search about phones and things. And the number one thing that kept popping up were articles that were arguing that you should never look at your partner's phone.
Really?
Like unless they let you, like you should never go over and look at their phone. Like it's an invasion of their privacy and that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking like, I think with our spouse, with our kids, I mean, we ought to be like open. Like you can pick this up, look at it anytime.
Yeah.
You know, I would be worried about having that kind of a relationship where we can't look at each other's devices. Like that's grounds for falling to temptation in a number of ways. But those are my thoughts. That shouldn't be controversial. That shouldn't be controversial.
No, not yet. I was reading an article and I thought that it made a cool point, and it was a nice way to think about it. We know and can see the side effects of smoking. So we wouldn't willingly hand our kids a pack of cigarettes, or willingly allow them to be around secondhand smoke for a long amount of time. But we willingly will give our kids devices, smartphones that are just a gateway to all kinds of stuff.
Yes, the effects of Facebook and social media and instant reward of seeing something that is, just seeing something that is somewhat gratifying or satisfying to some video or something that's just interesting to you, and it has some of the same effects that drugs have on the brain, and we can't one of the articles I read dealt with how people are struggling with that because they don't see the need to fight it because they're not seeing the consequences, and it won't show up right away. It doesn't show up right away. So someone that's addicted to a drug, they may see more of the immediate consequences of the drug, but someone who's addicted to the phone, you don't see the negative effects of that right away. It takes time. And you're right. I mean, that's a good analogy. I have said before, I think we're going to look back on, this the same way we look back on pictures of little kids, working in coal mines, or little kids, smoking cigarettes. We see pictures from previous generation. Go, what in the world were they thinking back then? And I think we're going to look back, a couple generations from now on technology in a similar way, with social media in particular for kids and teenagers.
Yeah, I mean, we've honed in a lot, and we've specifically said a lot about phones, devices. Ultimately, the device is not the problem. It's more or less the way that we use the device. I use my iPad all day, every day. So what are some practical steps, some good ways, whether it be in our Bible study, good features, technology that we can use these devices for?
Yeah, so let me make an illustration for you. I believe in the freedom of having a gun, right, and having guns. I mean, I just think that's one of our freedoms that we should enjoy and experience here. And again, guns are used for hunting. They're used for self-defense. They're used to protect against evil. A lot of great benefits from that. But then there are some who misuse them. And I think the same thing could be said of technology, just in terms of an illustration. It's not inherently evil. The phone's not inherently evil in and of itself, so we just got to learn how to manage it, not let it manage us. There are good apps and things, the ways that you can use the phone. I mean, the phone doesn't have to be used for spiritual purposes, but having a Bible app on your phone, having a daily devotional app on your phone, there are some good ones out there that I think are helpful. I have used those from time to time. I personally have found that I can't be as disciplined with that on my phone as I can be with other things, because it's so easy to get off of it after you've read what you've read, and you're not going to think about it any now. It's so easy to then just click on something else because it's right there. So I have not found the tools on the phone, for example, to be really that much helpful for me in my devotional time or Bible reading or spiritual walk with the Lord. I find it better to have all that stuff away from me, not even at arm's reach, to just have the Bible and a book and a journal, for example, and everything else away. But there are good apps out there that can send out to you. You can read through devotionals together in groups with other people, so you can engage with it. You can talk to them. You can share messages. Again, it can be used as a great tool for people. It's hard for me, and so I'm not as good with that. Yeah. Now, on my laptop, I have Logos, which is a Bible software that has millions of pages of commentaries, theologies, Bible study books, Bible atlases and maps, and all this stuff. So when I'm studying for sermons and all that, I love that, because I don't have to get up and walk around the desk and get a book off the shelf. I don't have to wonder where this passage in the Scripture may show up in some of my library books. it pulls all of them up for me when I put a passage search in. So I use that, and it's very helpful. But I also find that it's a challenge to not want to click on Safari and go see if I got a notification on Facebook or something. Yeah. And so I think just managing it. Somebody said this. I found this an intriguing statement. Back in the day, they were just talking about phones, and this is not a Chicken Little, because again, technology is good. It's good. I'm very glad we have this. I'm glad we have this because I can send pictures to my mom of the kids. I can get messages and all this good stuff. It's a wonderful tool. We just have to learn how to manage it. But somebody said, and I read it the other day, back in the day when our phones were connected to the wall, in the house, which you don't remember.
Long before my time.
But I do remember. I remember as a kid, when the phone had a cord attached to it.
Is that the one you had to spin?
It wasn't that the one you had to spin.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Although my grandparents had that one, the one they had a little phone in the counter where you had to spin the dial and you had to wait on it to spin all the way back around. That was really cool. But the statement was that back in the day when in a generation ago, our phones were connected and were not free, but we were. And now our phones are not connected to anything, but we are. They're free, but we're not. It used to be we were free and the phones were not. Now the phone is free, but we're not. And, I think we have to learn how to manage it, not let it manage us. Because media does not wait for us to come looking for it. On our phones, it's being pushed to us. Yeah. And somebody is controlling, what we're reading and what we're consuming and what we're putting into our minds. And so I think we got to be careful about that. Because let me wrap up with a couple more just quick thoughts. John Piper wrote in the foreword to this book, and this gets back to our original thought. He writes, "I wish I could give every young adult the taste of eternity that grows more intense as you enter your 8th decade of life. A happy consciousness of the reality of death and the afterlife is a wonderful liberator from the faddishness and empty-headed screen tapping. I say happy consciousness because if all you have is fear, your smartphone almost certainly becomes one of the ways you escape the thought of death." Now, again, he's all for technology, but he's just saying that, he's making the point that technology can distract us from deeper thoughts about eternity. One other book recommendation for families would be The Tech-Wise Family by Andy Crouch. I think that can help with understanding how to put technology in its proper place. Using it rather than being used by it. Yeah. That's all we're saying is we got to think carefully about that. Neil Postman, he wrote Dealing More with the Television, and he wrote a book a few years ago called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he was dealing more with TV and media in that way. But but muse is to think about. Amuse is to not think. And that's why, amusement parks. What's the whole goal of going to an amusement? I want to go to an amusement park because I don't want to think about everything else. And I think our phones become that way, distracting us from thinking about what's really meaningful. And we just have to be careful and set limits, and rather than letting it control us. That's all.
Yeah. Well, thinking about those limits, do you think there's any count when it comes to detoxing, digitally wise detoxing, whether it be long-term, short-term, from our phones in general versus just from social media? You think there's any benefits that can be found in any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do that periodically. I'll take breaks from social media entirely, mainly social media. I mean, you can't get away from the phone completely, like for a couple weeks or anything like that. Yeah. I can't do that right now. But I think like I do 2-week breaks or a month break or something from all social media. And during that time where I'm not on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and Facebook are the two that I use primarily. But when I'm not. I'm calling it Twitter.
It's X.
I'm calling it Twitter.
Sounds like something you would do.
Yes. I know it's called X now, but I'm calling it Twitter, and I always will. I'm going to be hard. I'm not old yet. I'm just 39, but I'm going to be really hard to get along with when I'm old.
Just 39.
Anyway.
Like double my age.
Yeah, I mean, no, I know. But look, I would just say back, I do think that there is benefit. I feel freer. I feel not as anxious. I'm not as troubled or worried about stuff that I can't do anything about anyway. Because, and so I think yeah, there is merit to taking taking detoxes from it. Now, I practice the routine of every week taking a break from the phone because I get contacted so much, with just a lot of different things and needing help and all that, or just somebody reaching out and. And so it's hard. It's hard to be fully present. And so every week on Friday, I take that as a day off, and I leave the phone in the closet. I deal with it Thursday night, put it in the closet, and I'll come back to it Friday night after I've had a 24-hour break. And I do that, every week. And that's been something I've done for about 15 years in ministry, mostly very consistently with it. I've had little periods of time where I struggled with it, but I've been very consistent with that. Over the last few years for the most part, and I think it helps to take that little bit of a break on a regular basis. But because life is just it's so different today because of that, and I think we just we're learning as we go how to deal with it and manage it. But there's great benefit from it. If you're on social media, I would say take breaks, like take a 2-week break. See if you can do that. Yeah. Take a 2-week break from it, see how you feel. Just shut it all down and say, I'm not going to touch this for 2 weeks and see how you feel after that. And again, use it as a tool, but don't be mastered by it.
That's a good thought. We're well over time, but tell me your plans for the rest of this series. How much longer you think you're going to stay in Daniel, the truth wins? Where are you going next?
A couple weeks. I mean, two or three at the most, and we'll be out of Daniel. But there's a couple more points that I want to deal with under the umbrella of truth wins that are maybe get us outside of Daniel. And so, so two or three more weeks, and then we'll shift gears after that. Yeah, got a lot of stuff planned preaching-wise for the rest of the year coming up, especially in the fall. Got some plans for that, but we'll get more into that in some future episodes.
Cool. Well, this was fun. Let's do it again next week?
Yes.
You'll be here.
I'll be here.
We want you to be here next week, too. So come back next week for episode number 8. Thanks for joining us.